Since January 2019, the US and its allies have recognized Juan Guaido, an opposition politician, as interim president of Venezuela, delegitimizing the Maduro government and Venezuela's institutions. President Trump justified this action by claiming that the US is supporting Guaido so democracy and the constitutional order can be restored in Venezuela. Of course, the truth is that the current US government does not give a damn about democracy. Just look at Trump's friendship with the Saudi royal family, General al-Sisi of Egypt, and other tyrants whose actions align with US interests. So it is clear that this intervention is about replacing an anti-American government with a pro-American one, just so the US can cement its economic and political domination of Latin America. Indeed, in a brief moment of honesty, Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, openly and gleefully fantasized about the profits US companies could make if Guaido was able to seize power in Venezuela.
Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of the United States. We both have a lot at stake here, making this come out the right way.
So it's just old-fashioned economic imperialism, an attempt to strip Venezuela of control over its own natural resources. As the American historian William Blum stated in his book Killing Hope, Washington knows no heresy in the Third World but independence. Since this is the case, it is not surprising that the US has long wanted to remove this left-wing government from power, siding with any thug or opportunist who shared their goal. In 2002, for example, the then president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, was briefly removed in a military coup, which was backed by the right-wing media and opposition politicians in Venezuela. The businessman Pedro Carmona was installed as president and instituted what would later become known as the Carmona Decree. The decree suspended the constitution, which had been approved in a referendum by Venezuelan voters in 1999, and shut down the Supreme Court and the National Assembly. Now, even though this so-called government promised elections, this was clearly a typical right-wing anti-democratic coup, supported by the wealthy elite against a democratically elected government that had been supported by the poor and the working class. In order to make Carmona's seizure of power look more legitimate, his lackeys announced that Chavez had resigned and fled the country. Unsurprisingly, the US was one of the few governments to recognize and legitimize this coup, supporting the overthrow of President Chavez, who had won 60% of the popular vote in the 2000 presidential election. Now, true democracy was only restored when it was leaked that Chavez had not resigned or fled the country, but was being held in detention at an army base somewhere in Venezuela. This inspired his supporters to march on the capital and demand that he be reinstated. This basically forced the army to switch sides and return Chavez to power. After Carmona was defeated, the US joined the other nations of the Organization of American States in condemning Carmona's coup. However, National Security Advisor to President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, made it clear that Chavez was to blame, stating, "We do hope that Chavez recognizes that the whole world is watching and that he takes advantage of this opportunity to right his own ship, which has been moving, frankly, in the wrong direction for quite a long time." President Bush himself simply said that Chavez should learn a lesson from the coup. So in the view of the US government, Chavez was to blame for the coup and he should learn a lesson from it. Well, if there were any lessons from that disgraceful attempt to destroy democracy, they were that the US is a hostile foreign imperialist power, and that the Venezuelan opposition is an enemy of the constitutional order. Now, to Chavez's credit, despite the hostility from the opposition and their imperialist master, Venezuela remained a parliamentary democracy, the very system that the US outwardly claims to support. In fact, Chavez went on to win election after election, humiliating the opposition's political representatives. Of course, conservative commentators in the US commonly called Chavez a dictator, even though international observers confirmed that Venezuelan elections were free and fair. For example, after Chavez had won the presidential election of 2012, ex-US President Jimmy Carter of the Carter Center stated, "Of the 92 elections that we've monitored, I would say that the election process in Venezuela is the best in the world." Now it is very easy to see why Chavez was able to win these elections. His social spending and reforms led to poverty reduction, greater access to education, and reduction in both infant mortality and malnutrition. However, it should also be pointed out that his government was social democratic to its core and very far from being socialist. In fact, between 1999 and 2011, the private sector's share of economic activity increased from 65% to 71% in Venezuela. You could actually make a strong argument that the Attlee Labour government in Britain and the Hudson Labour government in Norway were more radical when it came to economic policy than Chavez's government was. Nevertheless, Chavez was a staunch anti-imperialist and a Democrat, a true Bolivarian in the same vein as Simon Bolivar. Now, whilst Bolivar liberated Venezuela from colonial rule, Chavez defended Venezuela's national and economic sovereignty from US domination, fighting for the interests of the poor and the working class who have been the traditional victims of American imperialism in Latin America. So Chavez was able to govern for 14 years with the full consent of his people. Sadly, in 2013, after winning his fourth presidential election victory in 2012, he succumbed to cancer. The years following his death would be hard ones for Venezuela, both politically and economically. The first sign of trouble was when Nicolas Maduro, Chavez's hand-picked successor, beat the opposition's candidate, Henrique Capriles, by only 1.5 percentage points in the 2013 presidential election. Chavez, by contrast, beat Capriles in 2012 by an 11-point margin. This close result clearly emboldened the opposition. Capriles called for a recount which led to the Venezuelan National Electoral Council, the CNE, auditing the results, refusing the opposition's demands to conduct a full recount. When the council found no discrepancies in the result, Capriles called the audit a fake without a shred of evidence. He even suggested, again without evidence, that he had actually won the election. Of course, this behavior led to opposition protests and violence, which resulted in the death of several people. Now, the governments of Latin America recognized the election of Maduro. The United States did not, which of course encouraged the opposition. Still, the opposition's tactics fundamentally failed and Maduro remained in power. In 2014, another opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez, declared his intention to remove Maduro through radical protests, showing his contempt for parliamentary democracy. These protests resulted in the death of 43 people. As a result of this, Lopez was arrested for inciting violence and was sentenced to almost 14 years in prison, so that tactic failed as well. Now I think it is worth noting that both Capriles and Lopez played a role in the 2002 coup. After Chavez had been deposed, these two jointly arrested his Minister of the Interior, a clear sign that they supported Carmona's coup. That is something you should always keep in mind when these two men are presented as champions of democracy by the US and the Western media. In truth, they are merely opportunistic thugs who are hungry for power. Now, the big breakthrough for the opposition came in the 2015 parliamentary election, where they were able to win a large majority in the National Assembly. This was the first time the opposition had emerged victorious in an election since 1998. Of course, it was the National Electoral Council, the body accused of fraud by the opposition in 2013, which announced and published these results which Maduro accepted. Now, when the opposition took up their seats in 2016, they used their majority to start a recall process against Maduro. Now, in order for such a referendum to go ahead, the opposition needed the signatures of 195,721 Venezuelans, which is the equivalent of 1% of the Venezuelan electorate. The opposition managed to collect 1,957,779 signatures. However, when the National Electoral Council checked the petition, they found problems with over 600,000 signatures. In fact, they found that the petition included the signatures of over 10,000 people who were deceased. So due to this fraud, the same body that declared that the opposition had won the 2015 parliamentary election suspended the recall process. It is clear that the opposition should have left the names of dead people off their petition. Still, they accused Maduro of being a dictator, and there were riots against the government which resulted in the injury of 120 people and the death of one police officer. To add to this, the opposition, which clearly was trying to make Venezuela ungovernable, attempted to swear in 3 members whose elections had been declared invalid by the Supreme Court. Viewers should keep in mind that the same court also barred an ally of the government from taking his seat for similar reasons. But in that case, the government accepted the Supreme Court's decision. So in response to the opposition's actions, the Supreme Court ruled that the National Assembly was in contempt of the law, and stated, "Decisions taken or to be taken by the National Assembly while these citizens are incorporated will be absolutely null." Now, the opposition had sworn in these 3 deputies on the 28th of July 2016. On the 29th of March 2017, they were still there, which led the Supreme Court to take over the Assembly's legislative powers. However, after criticism from almost all sectors of Venezuelan society, including members of the government, the Supreme Court reversed their decision. The National Assembly, however, was still considered to be in contempt for swearing in those law-violating candidates. Now, the next big issue was Maduro's announcement about the creation of a National Constituent Assembly, which would draft a new constitution to replace the old Chavez one that was approved in 1999. The opposition boycotted the election, which meant that the government was able to secure a massive majority. This election, of course, was condemned by the opposition and international governments as a power grab that was designed to bypass the National Assembly. Of course, the National Constituent Assembly is not designed to replace the National Assembly. It is in fact a temporary body that will only exist until the new constitution is drafted. The fact that the opposition chose to boycott that election simply demonstrates that they are determined to make Venezuela ungovernable and are no longer interested in the electoral process. Now we come to the presidential election of 2018, which Maduro, despite the horrendous economic crisis and humanitarian situation, won in a landslide. However, the election campaign and process was heavily criticized by international organizations, including organizations that had once praised Venezuela's electoral system. Once again, the US refused to recognize the results. Furthermore, many other Latin American states, now dominated by pro-US right-wing governments, also refused to recognize Maduro's victory. Now, if democracy has been destroyed in Venezuela, it was destroyed by the opposition. The coup against Chavez in 2002, the attempts to invalidate the results of the 2013 election, the call to remove Maduro through street violence in 2014, the signatures of the deceased on their recall petitions, ignoring Supreme Court orders. All of these actions led to the current situation. Why did the opposition think they could get away with this appalling behavior? The answer is clear. They knew that they would have the support of the United States. Bush and Condoleezza Rice blamed Chavez for the coup against him in 2002. The Obama administration refused to recognize the 2013 election result and declared Venezuela a national security threat to the United States in 2015. Trump's 2017 sanctions, his support for Leopoldo Lopez, and his support for the Quisling Guaido. Yes, the US has been an enabler of this vile opposition for almost 2 decades. As for Guaido, when he declared himself interim president, 81% of Venezuelans had never heard of him. Now, of course, that is just one reason why his US-backed coup failed miserably. The other is because the armed forces and the Venezuelan people seem to be Bolivarian to their core, supporters of Venezuela's national independence. Guaido, by contrast, is the anti-Bolivar, the quisling who refused to rule out asking other countries to invade Venezuela. According to a Hinterlaces poll that was conducted a few weeks before Guaido's proclamation, 86% of Venezuelans oppose military intervention and 81% are against US sanctions. It is clear that the Venezuelan people reject US interference and want the current economic crisis to be solved through dialogue between the government and the opposition. As for Trump's offer of aid, the Maduro government was right to reject it because the United States has a history of using such shipments to smuggle weapons to opposition groups. For example, during the 80s, the US used so-called humanitarian aid to smuggle arms to the Contras, who were attempting to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua at the time. These Contras were known to carry out atrocities against the civilian population. The man Trump has appointed special envoy to Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, was the official who authorized these shipments. Now, I do not deny that Venezuela needs desperate economic help, nor does the government, which has been accepting crucial economic aid from friendly countries like Russia and China. But when it comes from the US, it is clearly poison. In fact, their bad faith in this regard can be shown when they try to accuse the government of burning the US aid shipment, even though an idiotic opposition protester was responsible. The US is not to be trusted. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that the government is blameless. Mismanagement and corruption and over-reliance on one commodity, oil, has greatly contributed to the crisis in Venezuela. I'm certainly not attacking those who are protesting the lack of food, medicine, and other goods. The US and its allies, with their sanctions and theft, have decided to make things harder for Venezuela. In order to bring the government down, it is clear that they would rather see more Venezuelans die than see the government succeed. So in conclusion, the US has been the great enemy of Venezuela's democracy for over 20 years. They have done nothing but encourage the opposition's violent and anti-democratic behavior and should be utterly condemned for it. The fact that the Venezuelan people have strongly rejected the intervention shows that their tactics have utterly backfired. As for the crisis, nations of goodwill should do their best to help Venezuela recover and encourage dialogue between decent members of the opposition and the government. If Venezuela recovers, it will send a message to the US and to people like Carmona, Capriles, Guaido and Lopez that their vile tactics do not work.